Welcome everybody. We're going to start with diving into still phase 1, week 2 of material talking about muscles specifically. We're going to start with, in this video, these first 2 learning objectives, describing and characterizing the 3 different types of muscles, as well as describing the structure of skeletal muscle, including the major parts of the muscle fiber and its function. So most of this is just going to be a little bit of definition kind of stuff and introduction to what we're going to be going over in these next couple of videos. So first big thing is kind of looking at what muscles are we going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at 3 different types, 3 types that we have in our bodies. We have skeletal muscle tissue, we have cardiac muscle, and we have smooth muscle as well. So it's super important to understand the differences between each of these types of muscles, especially because while there are going to be similarities, a lot of kind of your general test questions are going to come from understanding the small differences between them and also the similarities. Okay, so skeletal muscle. Main things that we want to understand is that it is striated fiber along the whole length of the muscle. So when we talk about striated, you see these little lines all along it, that line-like. Let me see, there should be a good couple other pictures, more like real life pictures. Yeah, kind of like this. See how you kind of have these lines that you can see if you zoom in there. Those striations, and we'll get into exactly what those striations are a little bit later. But striated is going to mean that they have sarcomeres inside of them, which is just super important for muscle, the way that they're going to contract. They are multinucleated, which means they have multiple nuclei per muscle cell. And these are going to be under voluntary control. This means that we have movement control of our skeletal muscles. We can stop and we can think, okay, how do I want this to move? And we can move it accordingly. They're going to be contract rapidly and vigorously, so these are really quick to contract. But they can also tire very easily. Think about when you start running, if you start sprinting, as soon as you start sprinting, your muscles very quickly get tired and you can start to feel them exhaust and you slow down. But they can also develop and they can exert a lot of force. And we'll get into exactly how they do that when we talk about different muscle types. And I want you to really focus and pay attention on that portion of skeletal muscle, the muscle typing and the job and the function of each of them. When we get to that point, I'm going to kind of tie it and correlate it back to the chiropractic adjustment and why understanding this kind of stuff is super important for us as chiropractors to understand how we adjust and what parts of adjusting are super important to focus on and practice. So stuff that we can practice, or you guys can practice now, to prepare yourselves to be great adjusters in the future. Next type of muscle is cardiac muscle. These are also striated, so that's something I'm going to note that in common. Skeletal muscle and cardiac are both striated, whereas the smooth muscle is non-striated. Again, cardiac muscle, that is the heart muscle. It's a little bit different. They have these short branched fibers. They say a lot of times they kind of look like Ys. When you look at zoom in a little bit, like here you kind of have a Y branch going right there. They typically have a 1 up to 2 nuclei per cardiac muscle cell. Most of the time 1 nucleus. Like there's one, this one, there's 1 individual, this I think one might have 2. This one here has 2, this has 1, this has 1. So yeah, and these are involuntary. We don't have to think about our heart beating, it just does it by itself. These are going to contract at rhythmic, steady rate set by pacemaker cells. We mentioned that super briefly. I mentioned the term autorhythmicity before. That's what this is going to be. This kind of talks about. The cardiac cells are autorhythmic, means that they can cause their own depolarization in order to have their own action potentials develop to fire accordingly without having the body having to tell them to do so. Now the smooth muscle, this is going to be a lot of our organs and blood vessels, where they're non-striated. They call them fusiform cell, which is kind of this fusiform shape, kind of like that rhomboid-esque shape, and they have a single nucleus. These contractions are very slow and sustained, kind of like when we think about our stomach. We want our stomach to squeeze and compress and do it slowly to slowly push the food and stuff along. Same thing with the blood vessels. We want the blood vessels to squeeze and maintain that hold for long periods of time to make sure our blood pressure stays consistent. Okay, so those are 3 different types of muscles. We'll dig into each of them individually. This week is going to be skeletal muscle. The following week, we'll do more of the smooth muscle. And then after that, we dive deep into cardiac muscle right before the first exam. So now, looking at the skeletal muscle, specifically, let's look at the different parts within the skeletal muscle, okay? A little bit of terminology first. Let's start wide and go small. So we should remember this, how we have the muscle tissue attaches to bones through tendons. Tendons are what attaches the muscle to the bone. And the tendon runs into what's known as the deep fascia. The deep fascia, this is the layer that's going to kind of encase and surround the muscle tissue. If you're not in the blended program, if you're in person for gross lab, you'll be able to see kind of this deep fascia layer and dissect it out and kind of look and see how all of that fascia mixes together. There's a lot of research into kind of fascia connection, and our body overall is way more connected through the muscles and the fascia than we originally thought many years ago. So there's a lot of cool connections that you can draw with the fascia connection. Going a little bit deeper, we have what's called the epimysium. Key things that we're going to see, anytime you see myo or sarc, these are going to be referring to muscles. So like myocyte, sarcolemma, these are referring to muscles. You also have, even thinking back like myoglobin. That myo is that muscle. Remember, myoglobin is what carries the oxygen in the muscle cells. So myo or sarc is referring to muscle. So that epimysium is that outermost layer as well. It also goes in continuous with the tendon as well. Then we have the epimysium keeps everything, all of this together as a big bundle. We look at each of these different individual bundles, and then we get a perimysium. Epi meaning the outermost, peri being the more in the middle, and then we also have endomysium. Okay? So epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. It kind of gets smaller and smaller and smaller until we get all the way down the endomysium, which wraps around a muscle fiber. This is where some AKAs come into play. So muscle fiber is also known as a myocyte. Okay? Muscle fiber is a myocyte. Same thing. Either way you say it, it's saying the exact same thing. The myocyte, the muscle cell, is made up of a bundle of these even smaller kind of fiber-like things called myofibrils. These are the rod-like unit, and they run the entire length of the muscle. So the muscle cells themselves are super, super long. They run the entire length of the muscle. We don't have like muscle cells that then like connect. It's one long muscle cell all the way across the entire muscle. So for example, if I look at the biceps brachii, one single muscle cell is going to run all the way down past the elbow for where the insertion is, and go all the way up into that insertion point of that biceps brachii. Okay? That one single cell runs all the way along. Recognize these, make sure you remember these terms, kind of the order: epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, the muscle fiber, muscle fibril. Also, a group of these muscle fibers wrapped in the perimysium is called a fascicle. Okay, make sure you remember each of these things. I'm gonna do a separate video on like the full structure of all of this when we get to a little bit more of like the excitation contraction. I think that pairs a lot better with all of this. So that's going to be it for this video, just kind of the introduction to some of the muscle types, as well as a little bit of the anatomy, which hopefully you've seen a couple of times before. Go ahead and, if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below, and we'll get on to the next one.